random tables. The reason why is because we were trying to do a little rearranging in here because we know it's crowded. So we're trying to figure out how we can lay things out. So we thought, well, we go back to separating the tables into this and then get some smaller chairs. That's our goal. These chairs are really big, and we have some smaller ones in the building. Some of you are sitting in the little black chairs. Who's sitting in a black chair? Anybody sitting in a black chair yet? Okay. Is it comfortable? The black chairs are comfortable, but they can fit more around a table and they're not so crowded. So we're just playing around with it kind of. So that's why these are empty, because they usually were a double table and now they're just sitting there. So anyway, we didn't actually need all of those. But anyway, we're just trying to figure out a way to kind of like maximize the space in here, because we want to have room for anybody that wants to come and study God's Word. So we're super excited about everybody being here. And as I always say, just come when you can. And if you can't come every week, it is totally fine. So those of you that are rejoining after 2 or 3 weeks, don't feel bad about that, because God's Word is right here. It's not going away, and we are just following through, so we don't really have to, we didn't miss anything through the past. So anyway, I'm glad you're back if you've been gone, and if you have to be out a couple weeks, it's spring, so we know that people have things going on. We have ball games. Sometimes those get rained out or they get canceled, which is good for some of the ladies that were going to not be here tonight, but now they're here because the game got canceled. So anyway, but I'm just, I know how spring goes, so it's just one of those things. But you guys be here when you can, so that you can have community, and then we can study God's Word together. So I'm super excited about that. I think when I was thinking about, it was interesting, and if you were at church Sunday and heard Ken's, and he does this thing, part of his message was about faith and about the wind, and I thought, he doesn't even know really that I'm teaching on faith on Tuesday night. It's just how God is, and he just always confirms like a new, and it was a great example of when the trees are down and you're like, how'd that happen? Well, it was the wind. Well, I didn't see it, but I know it happened, because that's what faith is. It's kind of like pollen, right? Go in the building, you're fine, your car looks good. You come out, it's covered with yellow. It's like, where did this come from? Well, it's spring, and pollen is here. We can't really see it. Now, you can actually see it kind of floating around in the air, but it's just interesting how, just how the message lined up when he talked about faith this weekend, and we're talking about faith. But anyway, so we are in our series in learning how to walk, be a woman of faith. And so we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 23 tonight. So if you're not there, we will flip over to Exodus some, because we want to look at some of the Old Testament. But let's just kind of do a quick review of the book of Hebrews in general, and just kind of a background for some of you that are just joining us, or you've been here, but you just a little reminder. So the first 10 chapters of Hebrews is all about why the new covenant is better than the old covenant, or it's a better covenant because it's Jesus. He completed the plan that God had. It's the new covenant, but ultimately, it doesn't matter if it was Old Testament or New Testament. Both Old Testament covenant and New Testament covenant are all about faith. So the book of Hebrews in general is about faith, but the first 10 chapters has you really looking at why Jesus is better than everything else. And so that's kind of the discussion there when it comes to it. But when he gets to chapter 11, he's really, really going to focus on giving examples of how the Old Testament was about faith. So you've got these Hebrew people. And if you know anything about the Hebrew religion, still today, if someone is a non-believing Hebrew, so somebody who still practices Judaism, they're Orthodox, they are very, very legalistic. It is all about the law. It's always been about the law for the Jews. They get very, very caught up in the law. And so that is kind of how they live their life. They're very religious, the ones that are like the Orthodox Jews. And so basically what's happened in here in the 11th chapter, and I don't know if you paid any attention to it, how many times he says, by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith, over and over again. And you're thinking, okay, are they getting the point? I don't know, but he's saying it so much because the point is, it was by faith that these Old Testament characters did what they did. So he's really, really trying to drive that home, because they believe in the Old Testament. that's their thing. That's the book that they follow. And yet they are struggling with wanting to go back. So this group of Hebrew Christians are struggling with this desire to maybe go back to some of the Old Testament rituals because it feels more like they can put their fingers on it. And it's something they can do. Because that's what our default mode is, to always go back to works, to always go back to what can we do to save ourselves. And I know it seems like you probably heard that a lot and you're thinking, well, I don't believe that. But do you? Are you for sure living your life completely by faith? Or do you sometimes live it by works? Because I think we all can easily fall into that category where you're starting to try to think, well, but I need to do better. I need to do this and I need to do that. You need to have faith and you need to walk by faith. It isn't about the more things that you can do. So we've got these Hebrew people, they're struggling, and the writer knows this, and he knows his audience. And so because it's an audience of people who believe the Old Testament, he's like, okay, I'm going to show you through these Old Testament characters exactly why faith is all that matters, and I want you to see it through their lives. So that's what this purpose of the book of chapter 11 of Hebrews, which is really, really a powerful piece. So we get to Moses. So this week we're talking about Moses. Now Moses is definitely a story that you've probably all told your children. It's such a fun little story, right? Moses floating in the boat, and he gets, he gets saved by the princess, the Pharaoh's daughter, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's actually it's not like telling the story of Abraham and Isaac on the altar. That's kind of gruesome. This one's a lot more fun. We're telling the story of the little baby floating in the boat. And I think it's just lovely. But it's much more than that. It's not just a children's story. It's a true story about something that God did that was pretty miraculous. But Moses is known to the Hebrew people. This is what you have to know. So they all love Abraham, right? But we've looked at Abraham. Abraham, he's great, but he's got some things. If we really dug into his life, if you studied, when I gave you verses to study about him, he lied. He told people that his wife was his sister. He had a baby with his wife's servant. I mean, like, he did some things that were kind of off track. Now, not that Moses didn't either, but Abraham is held up as the father of the Hebrew people, but Moses is their guy. Moses is the one that is probably the biggest hero to the Hebrew people. And he is the one that they really, really hold things up to. They model, they look at his life. But Moses has always been connected with the law. So if you think about, if you're a Jewish person, you said the law of Moses, the law of Moses. Moses is always connected with the law, and the writer of Hebrews is saying, let me show you. He is not about the law. The law is not what defines Moses at all. It's his faith. So that's the purpose of this little section, and it's super important to this group of Hebrew people that are listening, but I think it has some great stuff for us as well. So let's go ahead, and if you were going to read about Moses, by the way, you can start reading about him in Exodus, and you can read all the way through chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, because all of that's about Moses. A good bit of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that's the first 5 books. They're called the Pentateuch. Moses wrote them, and Exodus through Deuteronomy are about him, or about his story, not just about him, but about the story of the Israelites and his role in that. So there's a lot to read about him. We can't even scratch the surface in one little conversation or talk tonight. So we're just going to hit the highlights that the writer of Hebrews hits here. But I do encourage you to go back and read. And if you're reading through the Bible, you've already passed that, and you're probably in something, I don't know, Deuteronomy now, Numbers. I can remember a lot of people are reading through the Bible, so I don't know where you are right now. However, you probably have already read Exodus. It's not hard to read. It's an easier book than Leviticus because it's the story of the plagues and all that, so it's kind of interesting. But there's a lot of really cool things in there, so I'm hoping that what you read in Hebrews will just sort of spark your interest to reading a little bit more closely about Moses. Because, as I've mentioned before, when you read Moses as a child, and you're reading it as a mom and telling your little child, you talk about a few things about it. You talk about the sweet part of the story, the part that God saved him, the part about his parents taking care of him and keeping him from being killed. We talk about those things. But now that you're grown up, now that you're more mature, there's a lot more to all these stories. So I just want to encourage you to keep reading and keep looking for those truths that are so powerful to us now as we mature in our faith. So let's go ahead and read this first. I'm going to read the whole little passage, and then we'll stop and we'll talk about each little section for a minute. So starting in verse 23, it was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born. They saw that Moses was a beautiful baby, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's order. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of the king of Egypt's daughter. He chose to suffer with God's people instead of enjoying sin for a short time. He thought it was better to suffer for the Christ than to have all the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking for God's reward. It was by faith that Moses left Egypt and was not afraid of the king's anger. Moses continued strong as if he could see the God that no one can see. It was by faith that Moses prepared the Passover and spread the blood on the doors, so the one who brings death would not kill the firstborn sons of Israel. And it was by faith that the people crossed the Red Sea as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians tried it, they were drowned. Now, I read this from the New Living Translation, so if you're reading from a different version, you can see how much more readable it is. So that's kind of why I read from that. But what we get here, we get 3 different groups of people. Moses is the main one we're focusing on, but we got to start with the first people that are mentioned here, and that is his parents. So starting with verse 23, it says, it was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born. They saw that Moses was a beautiful baby, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's orders. Okay, so let's just talk about that for a minute. Well, the first thing I want to go ahead and tell you is the name of his parents. His parents are named Jochebed and Aram. Let me see if I pronounced that right. Amron or Amram, whatever, something like that, and Jochebed. So they actually have names. And so they were his parents. So if you know the story, hopefully you know the story. What happened is at the end, last week, we actually looked at chapter 50 of Genesis. Chapter 50 of Genesis was Joseph. He was at his deathbed. He tells them, first of all, when you leave Egypt, take my bones with you. So Joseph was actually giving he was given a prophecy. He was telling them, you're going to leave. Eventually you're going to leave. Now at this point, they're not slaves. They're there as friends of Pharaoh because they're Joseph's brothers. So the Israelites are there. This is at the end of Genesis. Well, now we're talking about 400 years later. 400 years later, now they're enslaved in Egypt. So they've been there, but that Pharaoh died a long time ago, and everybody died, and everybody's forgotten Joseph and Jacob and all that. So now the Israelites are there, and they have been in slavery to the Egyptians. They started out just living there, and guess they got bigger and God told them to be fruitful and multiply, and so they took him at his word. They kept having more babies. They kept getting stronger. God was blessing them in the land of Egypt. They were blessed, and the Egyptians didn't like it. I was reading from, I don't know if you've ever heard of a man named Josephus, but he's a historian, a Jewish historian. It's actually really interesting to read him. It's an outside the Bible source that you can read, and he was talking about how he called the Egyptians were getting fat and lazy. That's how he described it. And and so basically they were just like, they were not wanting to work. They started getting sort of lazy, and so they started saying, hey, we've got some free labor here, and this is our land, and they are not our people. And so they started kind of slowly but surely, the Pharaoh that was in charge there at that time started making them be slaves. And so that's kind of how it all happened. They weren't slaves at first, then they became slaves. Okay, so they've been here in Egypt, and the longer they're there, the more the Egyptians start getting nervous about them because they have there's so many of them, and they keep growing and they keep being blessed. And so this Pharaoh comes along, and he is like, we got to get rid of some of these Hebrew people, which is why he brings this edict to get rid of all of the male babies, throw them first he told the midwives to kill them at birth. So he told the midwives, like, when you're going and there's a male baby, we want you to kill them. Well, they were scared of God. They feared God, not Pharaoh, and so they didn't do it. And they basically told him, well, they give birth too fast and we can't do it. So they were being obedient. They continued to grow as a people. And then he says, okay, well, now I want you to throw all the male babies in the water. Just throw the male babies into the Nile River. So that's the story that leads up to it. So it's been 400 years since Joseph, and Joseph's bones, by the way, are still sitting there in not a coffin, but they called it something else, but whatever. So his bones are sitting there waiting for them to leave. So when Joseph gave that back in Genesis chapter 50, he was actually giving, like I said, a prophecy that they would come out of Egypt eventually. But, they probably got very comfortable there. They probably were doing just fine until they went into slavery, which I think is a really interesting point. A lot of times people, things happen. Maybe something happens and you get really upset because maybe you lose a job or something changes and you want to get really mad about it. But, maybe it was God ultimately, sovereignly, is trying to move you out of a place. And sometimes you would not leave on your own. Sometimes the situation. And so I look at this, and maybe these Egyptians were just going to stay there forever until they went into slavery. And then they were ready. They were ready to go back to where God had promised them. So they were ready to get away from the oppression. So it's kind of an interesting little point there. But anyway, so let's go back to Moses' parents. So Moses' parents, starting here in verse 23, they hid him for 3 months after he was born, and they saw that he was beautiful. Now, I think that is a very interesting statement because, aren't all babies beautiful? Why is that in there? It's kind of an interesting little point. Now, we know that not all babies are always beautiful. We always think our babies are beautiful. It doesn't even matter, right? If it's your baby, it's beautiful. And so I just think it's interesting that the writer puts this in here, but it's actually not the only place that we see this in the Bible. So it's in right here in Hebrews, but it's also in Exodus 2:2. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. So that was from Exodus. And then we have in Acts chapter 20, or chapter 7, verse 20, Stephen is giving a speech, or he's giving a sermon, and in his sermon he tells us the whole thing about Moses, which is also very interesting, by the way. In the early church, think about it, when they were growing as a church, the disciples did a lot of Old Testament teaching pointing it to Jesus. So that is how they talked about Jesus, the Messiah, but they always went back to the Old Testament because they're trying to reach their Jewish brothers and saying, hey, Moses was already talking about Jesus. Now Jesus is fulfilling what Moses talked about. So they do a lot of that, a lot of the sermons that you read in Acts are all Old Testament. But anyway, so Stephen says in verse 20, he says, he was a lovely child, lovely in the sight of God, is what Stephen says in his sermon. And you could go on and read more about that in Acts chapter 7. So this word beautiful, what does it mean though? So it's been used beautiful. Is it just mean he was a cute little baby, so we're going to save him? If he wasn't cute, then we would throw him in. But since he's so pretty, we're going to hold on to him. That's what it sounds like. Since he was beautiful and he looked, we'll just keep him. And we don't want to throw him in the back, So that's what it sounds like. But there's definitely a little more to it. So the word beautiful is actually, the Hebrew means lovely in the sight of God. So the actual word here is not just beautiful in appearance, but it's that concept that he was lovely in the sight of God. And so it's not that they just had a cute little baby that they wanted to say, but they knew there was something about this baby. Now, I think, and we don't have all this, and I'm just kind of speculating, but I think I can infer this. I think we can infer this from the scripture, that somewhere God has probably told them. God has probably given a message in somewhere or another to Jochebed and Amram that this baby is a special baby. So I don't think that it's just something that they're just manufacturing. He's beautiful, we're just going to... I think that somehow they knew there was something special about this baby. Something that God had planned, and so they wanted... that maybe God had some kind of divine destiny for this child, and they were going to save him because that was definitely something. So I think they were confident. So think about this. They refused. They were not fearful of Pharaoh at all, even though they were really putting their life in their hands. They were told to throw the baby Throw the baby. I lost my actual. Okay, got out of order here. I keep wanting to say throw the baby out with the bathwater. That is not what I'm talking about here. That is actually, by the way, if you want to know, just a totally random fact that's super interesting. That phrase comes all the way back from the Middle Ages when they used to all take a bath in the same bathtub. And so they would have like large families and they would all take a bath. And by the time they got to the baby, the water was so dirty that they could not see if the baby was in there. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's where that comes from. Okay, totally free for you tonight. So in case you wanted to know that. So anyway, so this whole idea of beautiful, so he had, they knew there was something different about him for sure. There was something, and they were confident. Because if they were not confident, then they would have probably followed his orders. Because it says that they saw that Moses was a beautiful baby, but they were not afraid to disobey the king's orders. So I think that we can kind of, like I said, be completely sure that it was something about, they knew that God had a plan. Now, remember, they're Hebrews, so they've grown up with the stories. They know, they've continued to tell the stories about Jacob and all the Abraham's, the covenant that God made with Abraham has been passed down. So we have no doubt that many of these Hebrew people were worshiping Yahweh. They were worshiping God. They did not go away from that. I'm sure there were some that were falling into the Egyptian ways, but most of them were living a life of Jewish commitment to, they didn't have laws yet, by the way, no laws. Moses brings the law, so there's no laws, but there is a relationship with Yahweh, Jehovah God, and so they have that. There have been these things passed down, so they know the story of the covenant that God made with Abraham, the fact that he had promised his people that they would have the promised land, that there was going to be a land that they would live in, that was going to be beautiful, and that they were going to be a great, great nation. So they knew all this. This is something that had been passed down, and so somewhere in this, his parents felt like he may be a part of that. Whether they just felt it just by looking at him, God gave them that sense, or somewhere they had heard that. But anyway, so they keep him for 3 months, and then something had to happen. Basically, maybe he started getting noisy. Like, we're going to have to do something, because now he's starting to make a lot of noise. And, babies, when they get to be about 3, 4, 5 months old, they start making a lot more noise. Maybe he was laughing, who knows? But they had to hide him. So then they hide him in the boat. So the next part says, so they put him in the water, obviously, and I keep losing my verses here. I'm sorry. Verse 20. So they were not afraid to do. So let me go back to this for a second. So basically, when we look at his parents, they really had to make a decision. So if you think about it, if the Hebrew or if the Pharaoh was telling them you have to do something, or you have to either tell them they had to kill the baby, they had a decision to make. And I think that's one of the things we see through this whole story. There's lots of decisions that Moses and the other people have to make. And that is true for us as well. We're constantly having to make a decision to walk by faith or to walk by our feelings. And so obviously in this case, the feeling could be to be fearful of Pharaoh, but they chose not to. They chose to walk by faith and not be afraid of him. So anyway, so you know how the story goes. They put the baby in the basket. He's floating along, and then Pharaoh's daughter comes and sees him. He's a beautiful little baby, and she thinks he's beautiful too. And she pulls it out of the water. She has pity on him, it says, and she brings him. She wants to save him. She wants to save him from this death. She knows that edict had gone down. Now, I think that when we look at the story of his parents putting him in this boat, so they really, they're still trying to save him, but they have to do it in a different way now, because he's no longer can be, secluded or isolated at home for some reason. So they're trying to do it a different way. But what's beautiful about it is they did their part, and then God intervened. So God's sovereignty intervened and brought Pharaoh's daughter there to save him. And I think that's a beautiful picture of sort of the human relationship versus God's human responsibility versus God's sovereignty. Because sometimes we do have to do something, but God is still working in the midst of all that. So she comes, she sees the baby, and then of course, you know, if you read the rest of the story, Miriam, his sister, is watching over the side. She goes up and she says, "Do you want me to get you a Hebrew midwife?" And one of the other things that was interesting that I read in Josephus was that the Pharaoh's daughter tried several Egyptian midwives, Egyptian women to nurse them, not midwives. Different, yeah, nursemaid. Tried some Egyptian women, and he didn't want to. That was from the Josephus story, and it wasn't until he brought a Hebrew woman that he would be willing to eat. So kind of interesting there. But Miriam gets her mother, and what a beautiful, beautiful story, because Jochebed, after by faith, just kind of trusting that God was going to take care of her child, then she gets to have her child back. And so that is such a beautiful, beautiful part of the story. So we get to, after that, of course, then he is eventually brought into Pharaoh's home and raised as a daughter. So basically, let's just read a little bit of the Exodus here. I have quite a few of these verses written down here. So Exodus 2:5, I'm just going to start there. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, and her maidens walking along the Nile, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And so, but in this case here, she took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." And then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take the child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So she gets to raise her own child and get paid for it. That'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Get that extra money for raising your children. And so she gets to go, and she gets to have her child back. The woman took the child and nursed him. And I think this is like a gift of faith, right? So because of her faith, because she was willing to not do what the Pharaoh had said to save him, God blesses her, which I think is another just little lesson here for us. When we are walking by faith and we're trusting God, trusting God's promises, he blesses. And blessings always come through obedience, which is ultimately, obedience is what follows our faith. If we believe, then we act on that, and then God blesses. So it's a beautiful kind of the way everything works together. But the child grew. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. He became her son. She named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Moses in the Egyptian language means born or son. And it sounds a little bit like the Hebrew word, which means drawn out of the water. So that's kind of where it was. Actually, the name Moses is actually more of an Egyptian name than a Hebrew name, which I think is interesting. So where did Moses get all his information about the Hebrews? Because you think about it, so he knows, we're going to find out in just a minute, we get to the next verse, he obviously knows about God's promises. Well, I think it happened while he was with his mother and his father. He was in the family for a while. This is going to kind of blow your mind, but we don't really know for sure. So he could have been with them till he was 3 and to as old as 12. So it could have been that he was with them for that meeting. So somewhere between 3 and 12, Moses lived with his actual parents before he actually went back to the palace. And we don't know the actual time period, but based on, just lots of different historical possibilities there, somewhere between 3 and 12, which means that during that time, he got to hear all about it. Don't you know that his parents were telling him? Well, they're talking to him about the Hebrew people. They're explaining how that, and he knows somehow, either they told him directly, you're Hebrew, but you're going to be raised in an Egyptian palace, or they just talk about the Hebrew people to such a degree that he is very aware of it. But I love the phrase that was in that verse 23 that just said they were not afraid. And this is a really important point here. When it says they were not afraid, they put him in they saved him, that is an evidence of their faith. The fact that they were not afraid, they were walking by faith. So fear and faith are total opposites, right? So when we walk in fear, then we're not walking by faith. So whenever you're struggling with being fearful, you need to remind yourself that the opposite of fear is faith, and I have to trust God. So that's the way you get rid of fear. There is no other way. And what we can come up with, you can go to lots of self-help books. You can read things about how do you get rid of your fear. You can talk about all these things about phobias and, how do you break a fear addiction of some sort or whatever. The answer is faith. The answer is God and faith. That's how we get rid of our fear. So their evidence of their faith was the fact that they were not afraid of Pharaoh. So we learn a couple of things from these parents. And so what I'm going to do is in each of these little sections, I'm going to give us kind of a truth takeaway that we can get from this. But we can learn from these parents. This is one part of it. This is not the truth takeaway. That real faith operates despite adversity. So they had all of this, possibility that they could be taken, they could be killed by Pharaoh if they didn't follow his rules. That did not stop them. They still walked by faith and they saved their child. But I think the truth here that we can kind of grab onto is when we walk by faith, this is truth number one, it allows us to not fear the Pharaohs in our life. When we walk by faith, we will not have to be in bondage to those Pharaohs of our life. So we all have them. We all have those things, those people maybe that we're afraid of. Proverbs 29:25 says, the fear of man brings a snare, but he who trusts in the Lord will be exalted. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, Jesus says, do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And we know that the definition of the fear of God is not to be afraid of God and just cower from him, but to be in awe of his greatness and his ability to help us and to save us from whatever we need. So God is great, and he does deserve our worship and awe and all of those things. And if we saw him, we would get down on our knees. We would not be able to stand in his presence because he is so holy and so glorious and all of those things. But when we think about it, he is asking us as people to fear him and not fear man. Don't worry about what men say about us. Don't worry about the Pharaohs in your life that might cause you to be fearful. True faith means that I'm not going to let those things get to me. I'm not going to let those people control me and cause me to not trust God. So, just a couple lessons from him. Let's go on to the next part of the verse, and that's verse 24. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of the king of Egypt's daughter. He chose to suffer with God's people instead of enjoying sin for a short time. He thought it was better to suffer for Christ than to have all the treasures of Egypt because he was looking for God's reward. Okay, so now we went from Jochebed and Amram, now we're at Moses. Now we're really looking at him for just a minute. So the story of Moses, he grows up in the king's palace, and when he is about 40 years old, he sees another Hebrew. He's walking around, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew servant, and he turns and kills the Egyptian. And when he does that, when he does that, obviously it says here, he refused to be called the king, he chose to suffer, and he thought it better to suffer. So basically, he, at 40 years of age, he has to leave, he leaves the palace, and he goes into the wilderness. And sort of, I read a bunch of different things, that it's like 40, 40, 40. So it's like 40 years that he's in the palace, or he grows up, then 40 years he's in the wilderness, and then 40 years he's used by God. So it's kind of how it lays out there a little bit about his life, because he dies at about 120 years old. So he has these little stints of 40 years, which I think is definitely very interesting. So when he was, up until the time he was 40, he was an Egyptian prince. That's the bottom line. His mother, his adopted mother, was Pharaoh's daughter, so he was a prince. He had everything that probably money could buy during that time. He had the prestige, and Josephus, again, like I said, it was very interesting to kind of read that historian, says that they believe he was going to be the next in line. That was probably the case. That is kind of what was passed down, that Moses would have been in control of all of Egypt if he had decided to stay. He was loved, and if you've watched the Ten Commandments, I mean, you know, Ten Commandments obviously is just a fictional version of it, but in the Ten Commandments, he's up there, and he's very well respected by, and kind of you see him as a very important figure in there. Of course, it's just, like I said, fictional, but it is based on truth, and there is definitely some truth in it. But he has all that. He has everything that you could possibly want. So being raised in this house, he has learned how to, so I've got a few facts here about what his training was like while he was there. He would have learned a lot of different languages. His formal education of Egypt included the reading and writing of hieroglyphics, hieratic scripts, the copying of text, the language of the Canaan. He would learn several languages, and this was really interesting. Think about it. If he had not been there, guys, he wouldn't have been able to write the first 5 books of the Bible. So I'm saying all this, and I'm hoping I'm making sense here. What's really interesting, one big part of this whole story is it's a story of the sovereignty of God. Because obviously, Amram and Jochebed would have wanted their son to be in their home their whole life and have raised their son. They wouldn't want to give him away. But by him being in the Egyptian palace, he was able to learn all the things that he learned, which made him end up being one of the most important figures in all of, well, probably the most important figure in the Old Testament. By writing the first 5 books, he wouldn't have had that knowledge and that understanding of languages and all sorts of things. He studied under the Egyptian education system, which was actually very advanced for their day and probably more advanced than some of ours today. So during that time, he learned the things that he wouldn't have learned just living in a Hebrew house. They were poor. They were slaves. So if he had just stayed in that, he would have never had this point to be empowered, to have all the things he would have needed to be empowered. And so, but what is interesting here is when he gets to this age, and if we're looking at Exodus, let's go ahead and flip back to the book of Exodus for a minute, because I want you to see it there. We're going to be in Exodus chapter, let's see, this little section here is, so we started in Exodus 2 is where we have him, I think it's at the end of this, at the Exodus end of chapter 2. Many years later, starting in verse 11, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. Now, this is where we know that he knows he's a Hebrew, right? But he's living like an Egyptian. So he knows deep down inside that he's a Hebrew, because he wouldn't have just had any kind of reaction if he thought of himself as an Egyptian. So we know he knew that all along. And so he was beating and after looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day when Moses went out to his people again, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" So we don't really know why this happened, but there's possible, idea that maybe he knew that God was going to call him to deliver these people. Maybe he knew that, and so he's trying to get in there and sort of make these relationships. The man replied, then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everyone knows what I did," and sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened. He tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. So then when he gets to Midian and he meets his wife and he stays there now for 40 years. While he's there, so up until those 40 years, he's been trained in the Egyptian palace, and then the day comes. And this is what's really important to kind of get. So this day comes when he realizes and he actually decides to live who he really is. So up until this point, he's living as an Egyptian. He's choosing to continue to stay in the palace. But that moment happened. Something sort of snapped for him. And he knew that he needed to, he decided to make a decision to leave. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. In this next verse, actually, verse 27. So while he's here, though, one of the things that happens is he is walking, he's got this prestige, he's got this money, he's got all this power. So all that has happened by being there. He has the possibility of power. And the thing is, at this point, he hasn't taken the role of being an actual hero. So he's walking around still acting like an Egyptian until this moment comes where he's like, he kills the Hebrew slave or kills the Egyptian, and it's like he's taking on this new identity, you might say. And the deal is, it's not that being in the Egyptian court is a bad thing. Having money, all that kind of stuff is not bad, but the problem was God had called him to something else. God had planned for him to be somewhere else, to do something different. And so he, in verse 27, that we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a second, it said, it was by faith that Moses left Egypt and was not afraid of the king's anger. Moses continued strong as if he could see the God that no one could see. So he gets to that point where he's like, okay, I'm done. And I think truth number 2 is walking by faith allows us to give up, because what he did by leaving Egypt, by walking away from the palace, he gave up power, he gave up prestige, he gave up money, pleasure, all the things that would have been a part of being in the palace, and he became a Hebrew slave. Or he changed positions. He left what was one thing, what was one position, to become something completely different. And that's why we know that he must have had a very strong faith, because think about it. Why would you leave this to go to be a slave? Why would you leave being in the palace? Why would you turn that down? Why would you reject that and go to just being a slave? Because it's to join this group of people who are not lifted up at all from the Egyptians' point of view. So he gives all those things up. He did that by faith. And then this next part, and like I said in verse 27, let me talk a little bit more about that. When he left it, this word that says, by faith he left Egypt, is actually a really strong word. The word means katatelepo, or whatever. And it's not just a simple departure. It's not like he just left. Okay, so this is really important. I think this is why I think it's a super powerful point here. He didn't just leave. It's a deeper word. Some commentators say it was more like a heart renunciation. I will no longer be an Egyptian. I reject all of that part of my life. I give it all up. I renounce it. It is actually the same word, same from the same word that when it said that they forsook all and followed Jesus. And so that word forsook that's in the New Testament, it's a very similar, it's the same word here that's used. So he gave it up. He didn't just leave Egypt, he completely forsook it. I'm no longer going to be an Egyptian. And I'm going to walk in the true identity that I have. So he made a decision. That's really what my point here about this is that the slaying of the Egyptian was an important turning point in his life. It wasn't that we condone that. I mean, obviously killing someone is never something that God would condone, but this is the deal. What it did do is it showed his deep and profound identification with these people. He knew who he belonged to, and he actually began to understand what his purpose was, as it was to be with those people, and he rejected this old part of his life. All of that kind of happens, and he was forced to leave and go live out of there for 40 years in Midian. But during that time, God builds him up. It took 40 years to get him ready to go back and help free the people from Egypt. So that was part of the plan. So he had to reject, though, what he had. He had to reject the good in order to get what was better. And it says in the Hebrews, writer tells us that he was by faith that Moses left Egypt. Remember, that word means to renunciate. Just gave it up totally turned his back on the Egyptian way. He was not afraid of the king's anger, and he continued strong as if he could see the God that no one could see. So, what does it take to have that kind of faith? Because see, what really happened in this case, and I think point number 3, is that Moses really, through this experience, he accepted who he really was, and it changed everything. Walking by faith, this is my truth number 3, walking by faith allows us to embrace our true identity. So, he did not know what God specifically had planned for him, but he left what was actually a very cush life, potential for maybe he could have been a Pharaoh and have set his people free, right? If he had had that power. But he knew that's not who he was. And he had to choose to, and he rejected it. It was a faith decision that he made to walk away from it and embraced his true identity as a Jewish person. And it really did require giving up. It required him to give up maybe something that he thought that could have, we would look at maybe and think is worth holding on to. And that's really what it means sometimes to be a Christian, right? Because we give up the desires of the world. We give up all these other things in life that could be, maybe it's prestige, maybe it's pleasure, maybe it's power. We can give up those things to follow Christ. Jasper talked about that a couple of weeks ago when he said, we talked about the verse, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. It's really what Moses did here. He denied himself, and he took up his cross, and he followed me. When you really understand, when you put your faith in Christ and you embrace your new identity as a child of God, it should change everything. And sometimes what happens is people are like, well, and I've heard so many different people say it a lot of different ways, but when you have your new identity, you're living as a child of Christ, and people say, well, why don't you do that anymore? Is God going to get mad at you? You just do that because you're not a Christian? The answer is not, well, I don't do that because God's going to get mad at me or just because I'm a Christian. I do it because it's not who I am anymore. I don't live this way because that is not my identity. I don't need to get the world's approval. I don't need to live this way because I have a new identity and I live in that. But it takes faith to live that way. It takes faith to know that God has a bigger plan. So if it means that you have to turn down a job that would require you to compromise something, if it means you have to turn away from friends that are causing you to stray or to be toxic in your life and truly keep you from really walking with the Lord. And sometimes you have to reject some of those things because your identity says, this is who I am. And I can't be something that I'm not anymore. That's what being a Christ follower means. That's what means walking by faith. And that's what Moses did. He chose to reject this life that he had to live this new identity, this true identity of being a Hebrew. And that changed everything for him. Now, he gave up a lot, but he gained so much more. And that's how we have to kind of see that. Sometimes the walk of faith is not always easy, but it is required to, it does help us. When we walk by faith, it helps us to embrace that true identity that we have as believers. One of my favorite lines, and it's really hard to be a child when your mom's an English teacher and she turns every movie that you see into some kind of teachable moment and the theme of the movie. And I'll never forget, we went to see Princess Diaries, and Kelsey she was younger. I don't know how old she was, and I was so excited. I mean, I came out there as like, that movie was so amazing. And of course she loved it, but not for the same reasons. I was looking at the truths that were in that movie that were embedded in the storyline, and I was like, this is so powerful. And so I go off on this whole big tangent, and I said, do you understand? She goes, yeah, Mom, I get it. It was a great movie. She's like kind of blowing me off and everything. But there's this great line. When Mia Thermopolis, y'all remember the story, she is up on top of the roof of something up there. They're playing basketball or something. She's up there with her, with the chauffeur. And she's like, I don't want to be a princess. And she had a whole situation where she had done something and hurt somebody, and it was like all her friends were mad at her or whatever. And she goes, I don't want to be a princess anymore. I'm gonna not receive. I'm not gonna take the crown. I'm not gonna receive it or whatever because I don't want to be. And he says to her, it doesn't matter if you don't take it. It still is who you are. You can't change who you are. You can choose not to take the role. You can deny and say, I don't want to be the princess, but you are a princess, and you're gonna. That's never gonna change. And I'm not promoting it. I'm not saying exactly the way he did it. Of course, it was much more profound. I was trying to find it, repeat it again, but I had to watch the whole movie and I couldn't find it. So anyway, but the whole thing was, but that is the truth of the Christian life. So we literally are princesses, right? Our Father is the King of Kings. And the whole deal is, you may not always act like it, or maybe sometimes you're thinking, well, I don't want all this that sometimes goes with this. Maybe I've lost friendships, or I have to live a way that maybe sometimes it doesn't seem comfortable or whatever, or I'm walking by faith and having to trust God, and I don't like that. But it doesn't change. If you put your faith and trust in God, you are a princess. Your identity is a child of God. You are walking with Him. And that is, you have to walk by that, trusting God, because you don't know what tomorrow looks like and you don't know how, but that's what a woman of faith does. That's what a child of God does. And it's actually a wonderful thing that we have to walk by faith and trust Him in that. So let me wrap this up real quick. And that is this last couple of verses. It was by faith that Moses prepared the Passover and spread the blood on the doors. And so the one who brings death would not kill the firstborn sons of Israel. You know, this part of the story is at the end of all of the plagues, and you can read about them. There's all these plagues. Think about the whole situation that happened there required faith. Moses God was telling him, I want you to do this, and he had to say things to them, not knowing how they were going to receive it, but he walked by faith. He trusted God. There was nothing about, so when people say the Old Testament was not about faith, everything that Moses did was by faith. He had to have faith to go to them and tell them to let his people go. He had to walk, he had to trust. He didn't know what God was going to do. He had never seen a plague. He had never seen a plague of locusts or a plague of frogs or a plague of, he'd never seen any of that. And so then he just goes out there. He is by faith. God tells him to take his staff and throw it down. He has to trust that it's going to turn into a snake. He doesn't know. So everything that Moses does is by faith. This last one, though, is huge because the last one was the Passover. And this was when God was going to kill the firstborn of all the Egyptians. And if you were a Hebrew, then you painted the blood over the door, and God would pass over that. And of course, we know now, we have the benefit, and the Hebrews that were hearing this during this time, they have the benefit of knowing that blood over the doorpost was just a precursor to what Christ was going to do. Because now the Passover for us represents that when Jesus died on the cross, God passes over for all of us who paint the blood over the door, which is representative of us accepting Christ, believing by faith that He did that, because it took faith to do that, right? They had no idea. They'd never seen this before, but they painted it on there and they trusted. They had to sit and trust. Is God going to save us through this? Is He going to do it? They did it by faith. They trusted that He would do it, and He did. And then, of course, now that represents the same thing that God has passed over us. We no longer will die because of the blood of the Lamb. And so it pulls it all together, because if you've studied the first 10 books of the Bible, 10 books of 10 chapters of Hebrews, it's all about the sacrifice, and especially chapter 9 and 10 about how the sacrificed lamb, and Jesus was that sacrifice. And then here he says, and Moses by faith, just like us, by faith we put our trust in that sacrificial lamb, that Christ shedding His blood on the cross for us, in the same way that Moses did that as well. And so we put faith, and then verse 29, it was by faith that people crossed the Red Sea as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians tried it, they were drowned. So the Egyptians didn't have faith. They tried to cross it, but they all drowned. But all of the Hebrews stayed alive because they had faith. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying, is it always, always, always was faith. From the Old Testament to the New Testament, it's always been about faith. So I think the last truth I have here is walking by faith allows us to trust God's plan even when it doesn't make sense. So the Passover lamb, they had never seen anything like that. Didn't make sense. What does this mean? Remember, the law hasn't happened yet. There's not been a law. There's not been anything about killing a lamb to cover your sins. That does not happen until Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. When they get into the, when they go out and when they're taken to the land, they go into the land of Canaan and they're on their way to the promised land. That's when he gives them the laws. They didn't have any laws yet. So this is all brand new. So that required faith and walking through the, but it didn't make sense. A lamb, kill a lamb, put the blood over him, and then the Red Sea, to walk through waters. It requires such great faith, but that's what faith is, trusting God even when it doesn't make sense. And we have lots of examples in our life all the time where we have to walk by that kind of faith. But I do want to wrap up with this. Exodus 33, verse 8. So this is so powerful. Whenever Moses went out to the tent of meeting, and this is once they got into the wilderness out there. Whenever Moses went out to the tent of meeting, all the people would get up and stand in the entrances of their own tents. They would all watch Moses until he disappeared inside. As he went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and hover at his entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. When the people saw the cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, they would stand and bow down in front of their own tents. Inside the tent of meeting, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. That's verse 11, 33:11. So, the Bible tells us the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks with a friend. What does it take to be called a friend of God? And I think the answer is faith. Because Moses was a man of faith, and because of that, he was called a friend of God. And if we want to be called a friend of God, then we walk by faith and we trust him. Even when things don't make sense, even when we're in a difficult situation, we have the pharaohs of our life that are making things hard for us, we trust. And that's what makes us a friend of God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for all the ladies in this room. We thank you for your word that is so powerful and always speaks to us. God, I thank you for the story of Moses and all of these other Old Testament characters we've been studying so far. Lord, they are just very challenging and interesting to hear and remind ourselves that it was always about faith. Lord, I just thank you for what you're teaching me and how you're helping me to learn to walk by faith a lot more. And I'm thankful for that. And I pray that for all these ladies as well. Lord, we just commit this week to you and ask that you would be glorified in our lives and that you would work and move in the different areas that we all have things going on. And we just, we love you and we thank you. And we just pray all these things in your son's name.